First of all, thank you to Dr. DeBrooks for organizing this event and for inviting me to participate in it, and to all of you all for coming out when it's 80 degrees outside in October. I want to tell a little bit about the story about how this book actually came together. So this is a bit of a different take than the other two presentations because what I'm presenting on is an edited volume. So this project actually started back in 2013 when Sarah and I met at University of Kiel in the United Kingdom for an environmental politics summer school. So it was the beginning of, I think, what most people would call a nerdy, but nevertheless, like, it has blossomed into a real true friendship. So if I have anything to say about biopolitical disaster, I think it won't be the last of the collaborations that Sarah and I do. We've all heard stories about the difficulties of doing collaborative work. We're all sort of afraid of doing collaborative work. People that won't respond, schedules that don't match, writing styles that just refuse to go together, personality quirks that make us go into our corners and away from each other. So Sarah and I really kept each other motivated, and our shared interest in biopolitics and environmental justice, the relationship between human health and ecosystem health, and really toxic governance overall really overcame any of those challenges that we face. And so our conversations that we started in 2013 blossomed into conference panels and then into writing projects and eventually into this book, which I think we're both pretty proud of. So I also want to take this opportunity to thank Sarah for her work on the project and just for, collaborating and developing an intellectual kinship that I think is really important, especially for young scholars getting started in an ever anxious academy. So I'm often criticized for the idealism that you probably hear echoing in the words that I'm saying. And this most recent criticism came a few weeks ago at the annual meeting of the American Political Science Association. A man turned to Sarah and I as we were having a conversation and asked us in a flippant manner, "So, what made you think you could do this project anyway?" And before I had time to think about a serious response, the words just came out of my mouth, as they often do. We just did it. And, his dismissal of our project bothered me, but I think that that same idealism was in my response. And the point of this is to say that it was idealism probably that sparked the project, but it was also the fuel that sustained us through the writing for 3 years and the editing for 3 years and the going back and forth with co-authors and collaborators for 3 years. But it's also the thing that animates the project of biopolitical disaster more specifically, more generally. At the end of the day, I think that if we don't think about how our scholarship and our work can change the issues that we're investigating, that we're trying to intervene upon, then why are we working so hard to reveal them in the first place? So I'm okay with the notion that there's some idealism bound up with this project and within my scholarship more generally. It's something that I've wrestled with, but I'm getting a bit more comfortable with. So as we work together in biopolitical disaster, it was necessary to have this optimism. And in undertaking scholarship about the perverse ways that life and death are administered through neglect, through greed, how it's tied to colonial mentalities, how it may even be inherent phenomenon of life itself, as some of our authors argue in the book, hope is really indispensable, I think. So when it becomes painfully clear how deeply embedded into our society and into our political economy disastrous rationalities are, which simultaneously manufacture and respond to crisis, optimism is an essential thing for us to keep going with the work that we're trying to do. There's a well-known saying that says, "You cannot correct what you do not confront." And I think that this idea is really at the heart of biopolitical disaster. By exploring the entanglements of biopolitics with state administration, corporate policies, everyday experiences of individuals and communities. Our book exposes ways in which the book exposes ways in which chronic and acute disasters have become pathogenically entangled. The project offers compelling accounts of the often unexamined conditions that produce many of the wicked problems of our contemporary world. The author's contributions are divided into 4 sections, which was a reorganization from the way that we originally had envisioned the project. Each of these sections amplify one another, and the authors provoke a conversation about how power relations shape life and death. The capillary effects of power demonstrated throughout the project help us to understand the functioning of biopolitical disaster in everyday life. So we're really reframing disaster not as this event, but really something that's inherent to the conditions of our life on an everyday basis. So the opening section is called Commodifying Crisis, and it questions the legitimacy with which commodification of disaster management takes place, how we often turn disaster into an opportunity or motive for profit. Governmentalities of disaster is the section that follows, and it inquires into the mentalities, the narratives, the sort of logics that perpetuate or enable chronic or socio-environmental disasters. The third section of the book is entitled Affective Bodies, and it illustrates the uneven ways in which political bodies interface with physical bodies, creating precarity and vulnerability in their wake for some of the most marginalized populations among us. The fourth and final section of the book is entitled Environmental Aesthetics and Resistance. And so the decolonial futures and imaginaries that are hinted at within the third section really lay the groundwork for this final section. Here, our authors invite us to turn toward one another, to nurture a relational understanding that acknowledges our collective hurt, grief, and pain, and effort to intervene upon the logics that produce it. So all we need to do is really turn on the TV to see how this biopolitical disaster is manifesting in our contemporary world. We've entered into a new phase for what I think is the struggle for justice, economic, environmental and social justice. But also the struggle for recognition and basic dignity seems to be a predominant feature of our modern world. Cases of biopolitical disaster are not difficult to locate. 3 weeks ago, Hurricane Maria wreaked havoc on Puerto Rico. Nearly 85% of citizens are still without power and water. The colonial status of Puerto Rico combines with an atrocious and racialized response from the federal government, leaving more than 3 million fellow citizens without recourse. So biopolitical disaster is not just about the stories that are in the pages of this book, but perhaps more helpfully, it is a way to help us understand why the administration is calling this sort of disaster response a good news story, while the mayor of San Juan is on national TV begging for help. On September 30th, Carmen Yulín Cruz Soto said at a news conference, quote, "People are dying in this country. I am begging anyone that can hear us to save us from dying. If anyone out there is listening to us, we are dying, and you are killing us with your inefficiency and bureaucracy." Our project not only works to imagine new possibilities for responding to the constellation of disproportionalities that are increasingly punctuating our everyday life, but it also explores the ecologies or interconnected ways in which social, environmental, economic connections inform our relationship to the environment and to each other. The chapters of the book weave together fragments of a larger tapestry, and a project that I hope might spark a consciousness of suffering that demonstrates that all of our fates are intertwined. At the core of this alternative ontology, I think, must be fairness, truth, equity, and concern for future generations, which I guess also indicates that my ideology and sort of idealism has not slipped throughout the project. So while many of the disasters of our time might spark visceral responses in us, there are persistent, less sensational forms of biopolitical disaster that circulate around us, which have to do with the systemic conditions that perpetually produce everyday disasters in our world. Generational poverty, for example, cancer, forced migration, people living and working in sacrifice zones, the neoliberal governmentality that masquerades as sustainability, but also poisonous corpocracy that's toxified ecosystems, communities, and bodies in the Gulf of Mexico, which is my contribution as a chapter to the volume, and the same thing in Chemical Valley, Canada, which is reflected in Sarah's work. So each of these feature in the book, but alongside the suffering there is hope, and that's what I want to end on today. So in the end of the book, in the final section on aesthetic forms of resistance, we have a poem by Christine Fry, and I'm going to read that. You've asked me to tell you of the great turning, of how we saved the world from disaster. The answer is both simple and complex. We turned. For hundreds of years, we had turned away as life on earth grew more precarious. We turned away from the homeless men on the streets, the stench from the river, the children orphaned in Iraq, the mothers dying of AIDS in Africa. We turned away because that was what we had been taught. To turn away from our pain, from the hurt in another's eyes, from the drunken father, from the friend betrayed. Always we were told, in actions louder than words, to turn away, turn away. And so we became a lonely people, caught up in a whirl, moving too quickly, too mindlessly toward its own demise, until it seemed as if there was no safe place to turn. No place, inside or out, that did not remind us of fear or terror, despair, loss, anger, and grief. Yet on one of those days, someone did turn. Turned to face the pain, turned to face the stranger, turned to look at the smoldering world and the hatred seething in too many eyes, turned to face himself, herself. And then another turned, and another, and another. And as they wept, they took each other's hands, until whole groups of people were turning, young and old, gay and straight, people of all colors, all nations, all religions, turning not only to the pain and hurt, but to beauty, to gratitude and love, turning to one another with forgiveness and a longing for peace in their hearts. At first, the turning made people dizzy, even silly. There were people standing on the side, gawking, criticizing, trying to knock the turners down. But the people kept getting up and kept helping one another to their feet. Their laughter and kindness brought others into the turning circle, until even the naysayers began to smile and sway. And as the people turned, they began to spin, reweaving the web of life, mending the shocking tears, knitting it back together with the colors of the earth, sewing on tiny mirrors so the beauty of each person, each creature, each plant, each life might be seen and respected. As the people turned, they spun like the earth through the universe, the web wrapped around them like a soft baby blanket, making it clear that all were loved, nothing separate. As this love reached into every crack and crevice, the people began to wake and to wonder, to breathe and to give thanks, to celebrate together. And so the world was saved, but only as long as you, too, sweet one, remember to turn.